Welcome to the Clued In Mystery Podcast. I'm Sarah.
And I'm Brooke, and we both love mystery. So Sarah, before we get started today, I wanted to share with our listeners a very special announcement. We had something fun and exciting happen. Sarah and I were interviewed as podcast hosts for the first time by Lori Lewis over at Kings River Life magazine. We'll link to the interview in case any of you would like to read it. That would make us happy. And I'll also remind you of Lori Lewis's Mystery Rats Maze podcast. The episodes in that consist of mystery short stories and first chapters of mystery novels read and brought to life by professional narrators and actors. They're really, really good. You can find Mystery Rats Maze podcast on all your favorite listening apps or on their website, which is mysteryratsmaze.podbean.com.
Thanks, Brooke. So today we're going to talk about spy fiction. And this was a really interesting topic for me to kind of think about and to research, largely because I've watched far more in this genre than I've read. And I suspect that that's true for a lot of people. The Bond franchise is one of, I think it's the fifth highest grossing franchise of films ever. And I think I read somewhere or heard somewhere that something like 1/3 of the world's population has seen a Bond film.
Wow.
I know. It's incredible. So everybody knows who James Bond is, right? But I suspect that the number of people who've actually read something by Ian Fleming or one of the other authors who write in the James Bond space is considerably lower. So maybe we can talk a little bit about that. But I'll start with just a little very high level introduction to spy fiction. Because again, this is something that, I'm not as familiar with, but we'll see how it goes. So as I was thinking about spies and spy fiction, I realized that the history is actually quite long. So if we think about a spy as someone who's gathering intelligence, Shakespeare in his plays frequently had characters who were eavesdropping or using what they heard to their advantage or to another character's advantage. And he had several female characters who would dress in a male part as part of a deception. So his plays weren't primarily what we would consider to be spy thrillers. I think they planted a lot of the seeds of what we see in that genre. Jumping ahead a few hundred years, 1821 saw the publication of The Spy, which was about the American Revolution. Rudyard Kipling's Kim was published serially starting in December 1900 and as a novel in 1901. And that brings us into the 20th century. Joseph Conrad's The Secret Agent proved also to be quite popular when it was published in 1907. And even our friend Sherlock Holmes played the role of spy in a few of Doyle's later works. But it's really only after the Second World War and into the Cold War that we see spy fiction taking off as being a popular genre. Spy fiction is rooted in conflict, and I think with the established news networks conveying information to the public far quicker during the Second World War than in past conflicts, it's not really surprising that the public became interested in espionage and its potential to impact the outcome of a conflict. And I think to some degree, spy fiction could be considered pro-government. So I wouldn't say that it's propaganda. I wouldn't go that far, but I would say that there's definitely a patriotic element to it that we don't see in, Agatha Christie's works, though perhaps her patriotism is just less overt because there's definitely a fondness for the English countryside that comes out in her writing. But in spy fiction, the protagonist, whether it's Bond, Jason Bourne, George Smiley, the protagonist is almost always working for the West with a big enemy looming. So in The Secret Agent, it was anarchy. It's the threat of nuclear war or communism in works from the mid-20th century. And more recently, it's global terrorists, criminal networks, or deep-rooted conspiracy that they're working against. So, the big names in the genre would be John le Carre and Ian Fleming. So John le Carre and he wrote several works about George Smiley, as well as other characters who were part of the British Secret Service. And Ian Fleming obviously was the creator of James Bond, but that franchise is so popular that the Fleming estate has commissioned 4 other authors to continue writing Bond stories. But I thought, Brooke, maybe we could start by talking about how the mystery in spy fiction is as much about figuring out where allegiance lies as it is about understanding why characters make their choices, and less about how a murder was committed or who did it.
Thank you so much for that, Sarah. That was fantastic. It was a great overview. But yeah, absolutely. The puzzle is different, isn't it? And that question got me thinking about a book that was on my shelf called How to Write Killer Fiction by Carolyn Wheat. And this is just a great book. It's primarily for people who are wanting to write mystery fiction, but she really draws a great comparison between mysteries, which she calls the fun house of mystery, or suspense, which she calls more of a roller coaster ride. I thought I'd share a quote because I think it's a great setup for this. So Wheat says, "In contrast to the intellectual pleasure of the mystery, suspense is an emotional roller coaster ride. If there is a puzzle element, it is decidedly secondary to the visceral experience. We read it not to be entertained by a detective sifting through the clues of a past murder, but to grit our teeth and bite our nails as our hero dodges bullets and evades danger in the present." So absolutely, we're not looking at a whodunit. We're looking at maybe more of a who's doing it.
Yeah. And, so I, to prepare for this, read a couple of James Bond stories. And yeah, you definitely get that. Your heart racing as, is he going to get out of this situation that he's found himself in, right? He's either staring at the barrel of a gun or, there was a threat of poison or threat of acid being thrown on him in one of the stories that I read. That James Bond is always going to get out of it, but there's still that element of suspense. I've read a couple of things that kind of commented on the fact that James Bond particularly isn't so much a spy because he's rarely actually gathering intelligence, right? He's doing the action, right? He's saving the girl or, coming up against someone in, a physical altercation. Whereas in the Carre's work, it's far more rooted in, talking to people and gathering information.
Yeah. Sure. Bond is an MI6 guy, but I think you're exactly right. Those stories are much more action oriented, where Le Carre's are much more intellectual. Like you really have to, that is one of, like you said at the beginning, my knowledge or background is mostly in the film or TV version of spy fiction. But the only exception is years ago, I read The Spy Who Came In From the Cold. And it is something you have to read and be very diligent because there is so much information. It's very, like you say, intellectual. He's gathering lots of pieces of information. And Ian Fleming is just writing about the action-packed side of the adventure as I see it.
And I think we see that in the film and television versions as well, right? Like I think about James Bond, like the earlier James Bond films. And I remember watching one with my husband. I don't remember which one it was now. But I remember turning to him at some point and being like, but nothing's happening. Comparing it to the Daniel Craig versions where it's like explosive scene after explosive scene.
Yes.
Right? So, I think that probably reflects a little bit shift in audience preference, but also, special effects capabilities that, are considerably more advanced and more elaborate than they were when Sean Connery was Bond. But so maybe those earlier Bond films are still closer to the spy fiction than being more action driven. But if I think about, was it BBC that did The Night Manager a few years ago? That was, there was some, dangerous element in that, but it was really about gathering information. So one of the other things that I found fascinating was thinking about how many authors of spy fiction have a history of actually being spies themselves. So I don't know if his plays were necessarily about spies, but a contemporary of Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, was thought to have been a member of Francis Walsingham's extensive network of spies whose information was used to protect the interests of Queen Elizabeth I. And more recently, Graham Greene, who wrote The Quiet American, reported to the famous double agent Kim Philby at MI6. Ian Fleming, who we've already talked about, he worked for did he work for MI5 or MI6? I can't remember.
I think MI6 as well.
I mean, there's a long history of authors writing about what they know, right? So lawyers writing legal thrillers, pathologists writing mysteries that involve kind of the figuring out the puzzle of what the body is telling them so that they can figure out what the crime was. But there's something, I don't know if it's because it feels like we as the audience are being let in on a secret that makes spies or authors who were spies just seem a little sexier. I don't know. What do you think, Brooke?
Yeah. Well, and I also came across these names of authors who Somerset Maugham was MI6, and C.S. Forrester was writing propaganda for the Ministry of Information. And it's even suspected by a recent biographer that Ernest Hemingway had set up a counterintelligence bureau in Havana for the FBI. But I think you're right, because it gives the prose or the stories so much more weight if you know that they know what they're talking about. And that's true for anything we read. It makes it more impactful. But because this is such a fascinating and dangerous and tricky mission, and I also think that it's interesting because we kind of think of authors as like the little nerdy, unassuming figure, but these guys were doing amazing and dangerous and, exhilarating things, and then coming back to write stories about it. So writers aren't always the wallflower.
So one of the things, just, thinking about spies being authors as well, is one of the things I read, I think it was Graham Greene, wrote something that was used by other intelligence services to understand how the British Secret Service worked. So I guess that's the risk in this author being also a spy, is them sharing, a little bit more than they should, which isn't so much a risk, if it's a lawyer or a physician writing about murder from their perspective. I'll have to look it up and find the reference to include in the show notes.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, the risk you take in, spilling the tea about MI6, that's a dangerous game.
Yeah, you would really have to be careful about not revealing too much about, I guess, the trade craft, right? In terms of what they do to transfer information. So the dead drops, or I was trying to remember whether it was something that I read or something that I watched where messages were passed through the spines of books. Yeah, and so there was a bookshop that kind of served as that as that location, and the conversation happened through the messages that were in the spines of books. I'm going to have to see if I can figure out. Maybe I have to go to the library, because I'm sure the librarian will know exactly what I'm talking about. But
that just excites a book lover so much, that that's the way that the codes were passed. That makes me so happy.
totally. But the challenge would be, if you've used that in your book, they can't continue to use that method, right? In
Mm-hmm.
If that was how they were actually, if that was ever based in truth. And obviously James Bond has all of his gadgets that may or may not actually exist, and so there's probably less risk with those stories. But you think about Graham Greene or Le Carre, and the stories that were more grounded in kind of the gathering of intelligence, that caution. I imagine that there might have been some people, higher up in the at MI6 who were reading some of their stories with a little bit of unease.
For sure.
One of the other things that I was thinking about is location. So in past episodes, we've talked about how kind of classic mysteries, really, we associate those with the UK, and hard-boiled mysteries we associate with the US, right? Like they're set in urban settings in the US. Much of what I read for our conversation was either set in the UK or featured British spies, right? So again, we're talking about Bond, Le Carre. Did you read anything that featured American spies? I mean, I know there's more. There must be some that are set with CIA or American intelligence, and I know there's definitely television shows that are based on the CIA, homeland. And then was Alias. It wasn't CIA. It was like its own private spy network or something, wasn't it?
Like a fictional,
but it was based in the US. Yeah. But yeah, did you like? I don't have any comparison. Have you read anything featuring American spies?
No, everything, like you say, it's all very UK based. And like, even if you think about the Jason Bourne franchise, I believe he's an American spy, but it all mostly takes place in Europe. So there's some like sexy intrigue, I think, with the European. And I really believe that it probably comes back to the fact that the popularity of it arose from those years, like you said, and with British authors, because it also is a very, like the Golden Age, it's going to be a very British feel to almost all the, the cars are European cars, and the locations are a lot of the very luxurious European locations. So, yeah, that's fascinating.
So the other thing that I noted is the role of women in spy fiction. So I've read recently a few books that women are the central characters, and they are playing a significant role in gathering intelligence. So I'm thinking of the Alice Network or the Rose Code, both by Kate Quinn. On TV a few years ago, there was a series about called the Bletchley Circle, about women who were involved in code breaking at Bletchley Park. But again, coming back to Bond and even Le Carre, women seem to really take a secondary role. And I think when I contrast that with mystery, especially cozy mysteries, where women are very well represented as sleuths, I wonder again if that comes back to kind of Fleming and Le Carre being the real masters of this space, and them really setting that tone. What do you think, Brooke?
I saw a large similarity between, and I'm talking about Le Carre and Fleming as well. A big similarity with the noir fiction women. You've got women sort of as the sex symbol, sort of as the problematic femme fatale, or the woman that they're not sure they can trust. It felt a lot like the noir fiction and how we discussed that with Frances. But you're right, because there are then more contemporary shows where women do have a lot of agency and are involved in the work themselves. I will say I read Trigger Mortis, which is Horowitz's first Bond book, I believe, since he took over writing those novels. And he is carrying on like the maybe the noir feature of women in that book. It definitely feels like a Fleming novel. Fantastic, by the way. I really enjoyed that one.
Yeah, I read Forever and a Day, which is another of Horowitz's Bond novels. And yeah, it did definitely feel like he'd done what he'd been assigned, right? Like he continued in the Bond tradition. And I don't know how the audience would react if he wasn't this suave guy who managed to, romance all the women that he encountered. Right. It just wouldn't feel like Bond if that was what was happening.
Exactly.
Alias was definitely, a very strong female character doing spy-like things. And then Homeland was also the main character in that was a female. So there are definitely some more recent examples of women taking a more active role, because I'm sure that the various spy agencies around the world would have both women and men working for them. So you would expect the fiction to reflect that.
Right. And I think just like we talked about utilizing some of the unassuming characters of authors as spies, certainly that was happening with using women in general, because it was taking advantage of the fact that people wouldn't think that of a woman, right? So I think that Bletchley and some of those shows that are set in, the 40s or post World War II are very accurate in the fact that I bet a lot of women were being contacted to do these sorts of things because people wouldn't suspect them.
Well, people wouldn't suspect them, and the men were actively fighting, right? And so, that meant that the women were kind of the only ones left behind, and so that was the role that they got to play. But yeah, I love those pieces of historical fiction where they kind of talk about that really important role that women were playing in the Second World War, and even the Alice Network is about the First World War as well, and I really enjoyed that and the Rose Code, and would highly recommend those to anybody who is interested in learning a little bit more from a fictional perspective of what was happening and what role women were playing.
Absolutely.
Brooke, those were kind of all the observations that I had about the spy fiction genre. Was there anything else that you wanted to comment on?
Yeah, I actually want to take this to a little deeper level, if you'll indulge me. I want to look at it sort of from a literary perspective. Spies ask these deep questions. A lot of times they're asking, who am I? Who's in charge? What's my mission here? What's the point? Who can I trust? And it's sort of the human condition questions. Jason Bourne, and I've referred to that again, it's one of my favorite spy trilogies, is a really good example of this, because he literally doesn't remember his life before. He doesn't know who he is. And I don't think it's too deep to think of spy fiction in that way. I think that all literature, even, pulp or commercial fiction, it reflects the questions that we all experience as humans. And even though something's very entertaining, it can also be thought-provoking. And it doesn't have to be. That's the fun thing about a lot of commercial fiction is you can just enjoy it for the ride. But you can also think about what the story is saying on a deeper level. And I really think spy fiction touches on some of those, who am I? What's the point?
That's such a great point, Brooke. And I definitely saw that in what I've read of the Carre's work. I actually read or listened to one of the last books that he wrote, and he actually narrated it, which I thought was really, really neat to listen to him reading his work.
Yeah.
I thought it was excellent. And I think even Bond, like he asks those questions. Certainly, I think Daniel Craig's Bond is, if you look at his arc, I think he's been asking some of those deeper questions about, like, yeah, why am I doing this, right?
Yeah. Why am I here? Who's in charge of me? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, Brooke. Thanks. So thanks for that conversation, Brooke. It was really interesting to kind of think a little bit more about spy fiction. I think I was a little bit concerned because I hadn't read very much of it. But when I think about how much I really enjoy watching spy films and spy television programs, and I could rattle off a whole bunch to recommend to people. I think the one that we watched most recently was Slow Horses. It was on Apple TV. And it was fantastic. I really liked that. But yeah, there's loads. Maybe we'll put some into the show notes, some of our recommendations. But yeah, thanks for this conversation, Brooke.
Thanks. I agree. Let's put some recommendations in the show notes. But for today, thank you for joining us on Clued in Mystery. I'm Brooke.
And I'm Sarah. And we both love mystery. Clued in Mystery is produced by Brooke Peterson and Sarah M. Stephen. Music is by Shane Ivers at silvermansound.com. Visit us online at cluedinmystery.com or social media at Clued in Mystery. If you liked what you heard, please consider subscribing, leaving a review, or telling your friends.